Welcome back to the Unfiltered Healing podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rachel. And in today's episode, we are going to get into some really important, integral information about where we are in society, really, and what has happened that has resulted in so many health issues within our population. And what I'm talking about is our food. So if you've been following me for a while, you know that I talk a lot about the importance of nutrition, the quality of it, the nutrient density of it, which is so important, and how that is really becoming a very, very big concern with, those higher powers, I guess you could say, buying out tons of farms and our utilization of improper farming principles and just the amount of really good, healthy nutrition going down. And it's troubling, right? It is definitely of a big concern. And when I heard about our speaker today, I knew that I had to get her on the podcast because she is really helping to fill in the gap and educate and teach on how each of us, either just for our families or for our neighborhoods, for our states, for our cities, can help to change some of these systems for the next generation. And I learned about our speaker today from actually visiting a regenerative farm in Northern California. And I picked up her book there and I just couldn't get enough of it. I read it super fast and then I had to go back and read it because there's just so much gold in her book. And so I reached out to her and asked if she would come on the podcast, and she has graciously agreed to it, which took many months because she's just so busy, and you'll hear about why. But Nicole Masters is our guest today, and she is an independent agroecologist, and she wrote this book for the love of soil that I read, but she's also done so many amazing things. She's a very big speaker on the topic of soil health and leadership. And so you can read the bio that I put in this podcast to just learn more about her. I highly recommend that you read her book because it really is a guide. How are we going to switch the next generation and have actual clean, healthy food for them to grow healthy? And, that starts a lot with us about regenerating our minds and regenerating our thinking about food and how it's grown and how it's cultivated. So I'm super excited to introduce this episode to you guys. As always, I ask that you please share, you please like the videos, especially on YouTube, and you comment on them so that people can see them. If we don't do those things, then people can't actually see the videos with all of the algorithms. So that's all we ask for this time, is just to share, like, mention, so that we can get this word out to as many as possible and we can continue the message of really integrative therapies, practitioners, and principles that people really need to know. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
What do you do to take care of yourself?
Welcome to the Unfiltered Healing Podcast with Dr. Rachel Hamill.
I ain't Dr. Phil. I truly help you heal your mind.
Connect with alternative medicine innovators that will challenge and empower you.
It has the potential to change your whole life.
Create natural balance for both your body and mind.
Your health is very important.
All while uncovering the truth behind modern medicine.
This is crucial.
It's raw, it's real, and it's unfiltered. Here's your host, Dr. Rachel.
Well, Nicole, welcome to the Unfiltered Healing Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
So I have read your book, which I have here, and which is amazing. And how I found you naturally to do this podcast was because of my knowledge of really how important nutrition is and how it's all reflective on the soil and, what you get out of it as far as nutrient wise. And how, we're really needing food security really more than ever in where we're at.
Mm.
And I love how you start your book with, I'm not normal. And I caught that really, throughout the book that you're just real. And it's not only refreshing, but it's also so relatable for myself as well, being an alchemist or what my mentor calls an experimentalist. Um,
Yeah.
I would just love if you began our conversation this morning with just a little bit about yourself, because your history definitely defines, what you're doing currently and how you got there now, which is really, in a sense, a part of saving our land and agriculture for really the next generation.
For me, what's interesting in the health journey and the soil and the work I'm doing now is how this story begins 3 or 4 generations back,
Mhm.
and what we're seeing now. And I think many of your listeners can relate to this in terms of the arising health crises that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
So my grandfathers on both sides were military. One actually served right after the bomb had been dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, went to Japan to help with the cleanup. And my other grandfather, who, spent a lot of time in Egypt and flew from a military perspective, but also became a top dresser. So he was applying fertilizer in New Zealand, um, using a DC-3, which is quite amazing because that aircraft itself was made for human transport and they were spreading fertilizers. But what they were putting in it at the time was DDT. And so if I look and track my chemical exposure and how that's influenced me today, it's very much been influenced by the epigenome. So it's
Mhm.
probably many of your listeners know this, but there's a gene called the MTHFR gene, and about 40 million Americans, I think, have this, or is it 40% of Americans have this gene? Like, it's incredibly high.
Mhm.
Sorry, is it 40%?
I don't remember the exact percent, but it's a high number for sure.
It's a high number, but you may or may not have the gene switched on. And so in my case, I'm homozygous. Both genes are switched on for gene expression. And so the MTHFR gene controls your ability to detoxify. So it's part of the methylation pathway in the liver.
Mhm.
And so my body doesn't detox, and neither do my brothers or my son. And looking at how this gene has been switched on through generations through chemical exposure. And it's fascinating to me as I got poisoned when I was 15 with paraquat, and I was hospitalized with that. So paraquat is fairly common, residual, non-selective herbicide. So it kills a lot of things. That exposure and that way that changed my life, because I spent the next 15 years really dealing with this level of toxicity that meant I had foggy brain all the time. I had headaches probably every 2 days, if not every day, experiencing headaches, migraines a couple of times a month,
Mhm.
really forgetful, just really, really struggling until I found a detox specialist who was like, you've got paraquat, and it's past the blood-brain barrier. So paraquat's one of the chemicals that really is traditionally considered not having any way of detoxifying it from the body. And by working with this specialist, we were able to use hyperbaric chamber, intravenous vitamin C, homeopathics, and nutrition to support the detoxification. And it was almost like I can say when I was 30, there's like my life before paraquat poisoning and my life afterwards.
Yeah.
But what's so fascinating to me is that my body intuitively knew that I had been poisoned. And so my life's work is about how do we get chemicals out of the food chain.
Yeah, it's super important and oftentimes very hard to kind of get to that answer because
Mm,
chemicals are rather hard to test. And,
mhm.
you went to this provider that did, as some view, like kind of out there testing, which is
Yes.
what I do in my practice, and we do lots of other things. But sometimes it does take those different types of things to find out because these things are really tricky. But a good majority of people, not just MTHFR, there's lots of them within methylation
Mm,
that make it
yeah.
really difficult. And the more that we're adding in, the higher the load.
Yeah.
So what, okay, from then on, then what inspired, because you've written other things, you got into this passion of really the soil and contamination and all of these things. So what began
Mhm.
to inspire the book? Because there's lots of manuals out there. You even said that you've written some of them. And what makes it so interesting is it isn't in a sense a manual, but it's also um, really like accessible and real hands-on information, which makes it so useful. So what was kind of your journey into creating the book?
Yeah, a lot of people are asking me for a soils for dummies book. And I'm like, there's nothing stupid about soil. But part of my training, so half of my background's actually been in behavioral science and social science and organizational learning, as well as adult education. So I'm really interested not in knowledge and information for information's sake, but how does someone learn and understand and then incorporate and put that into action. So the book was written for lay people or someone maybe new to soil who's really wanting to explore and understanding soil dynamics a lot more deeply, but then how does that relate to themselves, their land, their animals, their family? It's all intertwined. Um, and yeah, it's just, I think for me, there's so much information out there right now, and it can be really overwhelming for people.
Yeah.
Is how do we make this much more accessible and engaging?
Yeah, and honestly, that's exactly what it is it's super accessible and it puts things together in a manageable way. And I know we won't have time to get into everything on your book today. So we'll definitely encourage people to read it as well. But let's start with, first off, kind of how we've got to this place of really a crisis in a sense, globally even. And then how do we begin
Mhm.
to really rebuild essentially what we can control? So let's kind of start with how we've gotten there first.
We can look at the industrialization of food, the commoditization of food.
Mhm.
Um, I think the disassociation from people from food production. A lot of this wave, I guess, really broke in the 1940s. But you can look at land degradation and soil degradation as beginning really when the plow was first created, and then
Mhm.
certainly looking at what happened with the Dust Bowl in this country. And what's interesting is the Dust Bowl that happened in the 1930s here was also happening concurrently around the world. In Australia was having massive desolation of soil reserves around the same time. New Zealand was probably more like the 1950s when we see that legacy of industrial approaches to food production
Yeah.
just decimating our bank account of soil. Um, and I think it's part of it is this drive for bigger and better and really getting rid of the small landowner, the small family farms, which I think we're now down to 1% in the US of that food production. Like there's very few farmers, percentage wise, and it's like this is the most important piece is where does your food come from? And less people are actually producing that food.
And do you think because of the such immense pressure of that drove so many people to use a lot of those chemicals and things for that type of production? Or do you think it was some other type of cause?
Yeah, I think the minute that you only value yield, then yield at any cost. And so a lot of the costs of agriculture are realized outside of agriculture, be that soil losses or greenhouse gas emissions or water quality or food quality, um, that that's not born for itself necessarily on the land. And a lot of this has been from chemical producers. And you look at who's making the money, it really is those external driving forces from the supermarkets to the chemical suppliers to sustain an unsustainable model, right? And the cost of that really is farmer well-being as well. So we see, huge issues with mental health, with debt loading, um, despair. Yeah, I mean, this is not a system that's working for farmers.
Yeah, it goes pretty deep. It's more or less, in a sense, also the medical system. That's how deep that can go. and how
Yeah.
controlled it is by certain things we won't speak on here. So knowing that, you said like less than or 1% is actually truly, if we're just talking about the US, which is so low, then, I guess we could typically say that most conventional farming then is pretty toxic. Um, how far, or I don't even know if you can answer this. So, but how far do you think, like soil wise, things from so much chemicalization of that is being destroyed? I mean, is it like a certain level down depth, or how would you be able to determine that other than a soil test, which we'll talk about later?
Yeah, I don't think you would even determine it with a soil test. Well, in this country, you're losing around 5 tons an acre average a year of soil. But what we're seeing is many areas now are farming on subsoil. So they've lost all of that topsoil layer that's moved. Some areas in Iowa are losing up to 100 tons of topsoil per acre per year. And to put that into like, what does that look like? It's about the thickness of a sheet of paper. So is 1 ton. So as we're losing tonnages, it's like there's just this death by 1,000 paper cuts, really. It's just slowly eroding away. And that's really the legacy of industrial agriculture. I mean, we're seeing these dust storms now. I think there was one, was it 2, 3 years ago, that went all the way from Alberta to Texas. I mean, these massive, massive dust storms
Yeah.
that people died because you had car accidents on the highways.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same here with like raining and flooding because the, topsoil, like you said, is so dead, like it doesn't seep into the soil. So it just like creates all these landslides and floods and stuff like that as well. And I'm sure
Yeah.
there's other reasons for that, but it's similar. It's similar in that sense.
Mhm.
So let's talk about how you also kind of break up the different species that are needed in the soil. Um, because now, because of many people that are talking about it in research, we know how beneficial in humans it is to have all these different types of species in our microbiome. And that
Mhm.
accounts for a good amount of our actual immune system. And you mentioned how the soil and plant health are very similarly the same because, plants have in themselves a digestive system. So could you spend a little bit of time on why it's so important to have all those different species and what those exactly are?
Mm. Well, I think I'm not a microbiologist. I'm an agroecologist.
Right?
But what we're learning is very interesting in terms of the parallels to human health. And it seems that um, organisms themselves can flick from being pathogenic to symbiotic or beneficial depending on the environment. So, this idea that there's specific organisms that are good or bad, I think the literature is really challenging that, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah.
But what we want to see is much diversity of microbiology in that soil and also in the plant. So just like us, like less than 10% of your microbiome or the cells in your body are human, most of your cells in the body are microbial. It's the same in the plant. And it could be around the same statistic that only 10% of plant cells are actually plants. The rest of it are endophytes, microbiology, bacteria, fungi, even protozoa are now being found to be inside the cells of plants. And we are undermining that in a couple of different ways. One, by applying chemicals, also through plant breeding, but that whole microbiome around the plant system, which is really what sets it up for nutrition to the plant, these different plants, metabolites that we need for human nutrition, is what we see is now plants are no longer signaling or communicating with their microbial partners because those genes are being switched off back to the epigenome. The genes are switched off, the plants are no longer able to communicate, and then that influences the uptake of different nutrients or the secondary metabolites that we need for human health. So I feel like we're really on the new frontier and the cutting edge of this space right now of looking at what's the impact of how we manage soil on food quality, what's the impact of diversity even on animal health. And now we finally have human feeding studies where you can look at what's the impact of eating food or eating meat from properties that have minimal biodiversity of plants and not looking after soil, then what we see is an increase of the inflammatory markers for things like heart disease, obesity, um, Alzheimer's. Is
Yeah.
there's this very tight linkage, right? And so you could narrow it down to the specifics of, we know that some of these organisms are very helpful, like the lactobacillus, for instance, very helpful in soil, like it is in our own bodies. But really, it comes down to diversity, just having as much biomass of as much diversity as we can in that soil system, because that's what builds resilience for plants, builds resilience against climatic fluctuations, but it's in turn what is enabling the plant to produce the metabolites that it needs to then give to us.
Yeah, and you do that so excellently in that section, because I know this is shifting as well from what you have said, as people are getting away from like bad guys, good guys, and just diversity. And you do an excellent job in that section of like talking about viruses and parasites and fungi. Fungi is like really important. I learned in this soil health.
Yeah.
And how it really is such a cultivation, because you talk about how the plant kind of outsources a lot of its stuff to the soil. And so if the soil doesn't have what it needs through all of those species, then, like you said, the plant, in a sense, will not be adequate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's almost like they're hydroponically farming in a lot of ways, because you lose all that microbial diversity. Um, and what we see is a lot more pathogens. So then people are applying fungicides and pesticides, which create more pathogens. And now you're in this vicious cycle, but then the food quality is what's suffering.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think one of the molecules that we see, an essential amino acid that we see come through into the plants, is called ergothioneine. And ergothionene's been linked to human longevity. Well, it comes from a relationship with beneficial fungi in the soil and in the plant. And so what we see is fungi are the first ones that really, the beneficial fungi are really important. They're the first ones to leave when we are negatively impacting our soil microbiome. And we need it. We need these elements in our food that we really don't have anymore.
Yeah. Ergothioneine is really high in lots of different mushrooms. So
Mhm.
fungi species, right? As well.
Yeah.
That's really
Eat your
interesting.
shrooms.
Eat,
Yeah.
eat your shrooms. Yes, definitely. Um, so the first step obviously is going to be stop killing the good guys, as we've stated.
Yeah.
Is to, stop spraying as much, stop using, stop killing. Um,
Mhm.
and kind of getting out of the way of that. What are some other steps we can begin to do as well?
Yeah, so I try not to use too much dogma of like stop and no and don't do this. And instead, we look at what other things that we can do, what can be substituted, perhaps.
Mhm.
Why do you have these particular issues? What we find with a lot of properties, that they're putting on nitrogen because they think that they need it to grow a crop.
Yeah.
But often nitrogen's linked to soil structure and to soil microbiology, because there's a bunch of microbes that will actually take nitrogen from the atmosphere and then make that plant available. But if you're degrading your soil structure, then we lose these important organisms. So addressing the conditions, why is your soil compacted? Why isn't soil breathing? Um, and then looking for, let's say you have been using a pesticide or a fungicide, is there a biocontrol agent that we can use instead? These incredible fungal biocontrols that we can put onto seed, and they live as an endophyte, so they live inside that plant, and they wait basically until some herbivore comes along, some insect chews on it, and then they infect that insect. That insect will die, like that TV show, so This Is Us, all of us.
Mm.
There's a TV show that's about a cordyceps mushroom getting into the human population and taking over your brains and turning humans into zombies. I love these zombie shows.
The
But
lighthearted one.
yeah, there are mushrooms or fungi that will live inside plants and will do the same thing. So they change the brain chemistry of insects. They'll change behavior of insects. But when that insect dies, the plant then is able to use its fungal networks to reach out and take the nitrogen from the body of that insect and bring it back to the plant. So there's this whole natural insect control that happens in soils when soils are healthy. But what we find is when soils become compacted, then we lose these beneficial fungal partners. So there's cordyceps. They're called entomopathogenic fungi. And these organisms live in and on plants and in the soil, basically waiting to scavenge the nutrients from different insects. So we can put things like that as seed treatments. I really encourage people to make their own seed treatments if they're able to do things like that. If people are using herbicides, then we look at, well, can we buffer that herbicide with some kind of food, reduce the amount of herbicide you're using, address why it is that you have herbicide resistance. So we really kind of come at it from asking the why question of what we're seeing on the landscape, what's your landscape really telling you, and then how do we get off this chemical treadmill so that people can start to make money. And what's interesting is following these approaches, on average, producers are about 80% more profitable when they start to shift to a soil health, a regenerative approach to agriculture.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. I think you
Yeah.
mentioned, was it fulvic acid as kind of one of those
Yeah.
buffers as well? Because we use it
Yes.
a lot, for patients, with
Mhm.
toxins and things of that nature as well. So you also utilize
Yeah.
that in the soil, which I thought was really interesting
Yeah.
to kind of buffer that
It's
up.
so cool. Yeah. So you think about fulvic and humic acid's role in the bodies as binders. So they'll bind to chemicals. They'll also bind to any mycotoxins. So, we know there's mycotoxins in human food, but there's also mycotoxins in the environment that might affect if you had grazing animals, for instance. So
Mm.
using these carbon-based binders, but they also relax the villi of the gut. So I think you're probably using them for like tight junction repair in the gut system.
Mhm.
In plants, they increase the cell wall permeability. So if we are using, let's say, foliar fertilizers or herbicides, that actually helps the uptake of that chemical or that nutrition into the plant. So it means we don't need to use as much. A lot of modern farming systems are incredibly inefficient. A lot of the inputs are very inefficient. Nutrients either lock up or volatilize or leach away. And so by thinking about it in terms of this really is a carbon-based, food-based pathway that everything needs to be going through that carbon cycle, then that improves our uptake of nutrient.
Yeah, so fascinating. Going back just for a minute, when you talked about another problem is like compacted soil. Um,
Mhm.
can you explain a little bit what that means, except for the obvious? It's compacted. Like
Yeah.
what does that mean, or how does that occur?
Yeah. Um, well, there can be multiple reasons for why compaction has occurred. It might be that people have lost organic matter, so that could have happened during the Dust Bowl. Um, and when we think about compaction, really, it is that you've lost any of that beautiful, what we call aggregates, so the crumb structure, that there's air and water movement through a soil. And we get these plates, we get these very tight soils.
Mm.
That could also be due to mineral imbalances. So we see things like high potassium or magnesium can make soils very tight, and could be a microbial imbalance. So as we lose our fungi, the fungi are what making the crumbs and allowing those pore spaces. So if we lose fungi and become what we call bacterial dominated, then those soils just collapse. It might also be due to just poor management. So working soils when they're wet, overgrazing, applying a lot of chemicals will all cause that structure to collapse. And, some of these fertilizers, like you take anhydrous nitrogen, was used during World War II to create landing strips. And then people are out there using this as a fertilizer. And so what it does is it and collapses your soil structure. So we talk about those soils like that constipated, because it's the same as in the human body, that you're not going to get nutrient cycling. We don't get decomposition. You don't get that microbial breakdown. And as we know for humans, there's problems with your water cycle. There's all sorts of things that happen in the human body that are also happening in the soil.
Yeah, it's so closely correlated.
Yeah, it really is.
And oxygen or air, for instance,
Yeah.
is the number one thing that we have to survive. I mean, yes, we need water first, but oxygen, and so we don't really the soil needs to breathe as well, and these organisms need to breathe. And so,
Yeah.
thank you for explaining that, because I think people are like, "What is compacted mean? Hop on it or
Yeah.
something?"
Yeah. But it's the same as in the human body, air is number one. You're not going to survive long without any air, any oxygen.
Yeah.
But in the soil environment, the number one factor is actually sunlight capture. So everything runs off how efficient is photosynthesis, how well am I capturing sunlight energy? And what we're seeing globally is that we're very inefficient at capturing sunlight, that we're seeing a lot of bare ground, or the practices of chemical fallow where they come in and spray and just have bare ground, or desertification. And what that means is we're really bypassing this whole free energy that's coming from the sun into the soil, or driving biodiversity, because everything feeds from that initial input of sunlight energy. So if you are undermining that in any way, then we're undermining everything from insects to birds to wildlife to water quality is all impacted by that,
Yeah.
breaking that cycle down, which is quite intense. But then that also links into climate change. And I think most people have been focused on the carbon model of climate change. And I think if you look at it, really, that happened politically. That was a political decision, instead of looking at actually there's three legs to this stool. One of them is greenhouse gases, and the other one is land management, and the third one is water. So what we see is those are the biggest drivers for climate change. And so by getting back to the basics of how do we get biodiversity, how do we get ground cover, then actually this is a societal factor. We need to all be interested in how food's being grown.
Yeah, because you definitely mentioned a bit about the carbon imprint and how through the practices that you talk about in the book, like they're able to increase that dramatically in in their soil. So, it's not all doom and gloom. There's ways we can be a part of the process to help, fix it,
Oh,
of the solution.
yeah.
So were you
Mhm.
saying, coming back for a minute, were you saying that, I want to make sure I understand this, that the fertilizer on the ground makes a barrier between the sun getting it? Was that what you were saying? Like on the bare ground, the fertilizer creates a barrier for the sun to get into there? Was that what you were saying, or did I
Well, in part, so um, we can look at air movement, gas exchange in the soil, and then what's driving that aggregation is the whole system that's being fed by the plant, which is sugars being exuded out the root system, microbiology, you're feeding on that, a diversity of different plants, solar panels, and having full ground cover. So that whole system is what's driving all of this aggregation and this breath. So every day the planet breathes in and breathes out. It's been driven by what's happening underneath the ground, and having ground cover, right? And a diversity of ground cover. And what we're seeing are these monocultures across so much of our productive ecosystems. And we also then get bare ground. So you see bare ground at the beginning or the end of a growing season, or people choosing to have chemical fallow where they take land out of production, and then this whole system just collapses.
Wow, interesting. So, do you recommend that anyone, like, thinking about purchasing land, or maybe someone having land and starting over, or wanting to do something with their land, to get like their soil tested first? Is that something that you did before you purchased your property in Montana?
No, I knew it was degraded, and that's kind of what we wanted to play with, was taking on degraded land.
Got it.
Um, I always question my sanity once we're doing that, but yeah, not necessarily like soil test, but certainly digging holes, like to take a look before you buy a piece of land, like dig a hole and see, do we have some major issues with soil structure? Is there a big plow pan? Are there limitations to being able to, for roots to move down through that soil profile? Because that's that could be very costly to remediate, especially if there's not a lot of topsoil. I find most people don't dig a hole before they buy land, which always blows my mind. It's your biggest investment.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think just getting a shovel and taking a look, and what conditions are you dealing with, and then getting a bit of history from that land, like how much ag chemicals been applied, because often what you find is that ag chemical can be built up in layers in the soil, and then you get new ownership and you start to build soil health, and then those ag chemicals can be liberated. So that can be a bit of a problem. But there are things that we can do. Coming back to the fulvic and humic acids, we can use those binders if you are taking on land. I think the concern with PFOS and PFAS and the forever chemicals, and heavy metals is probably more of a concern. So making sure you're not buying land that potentially has had like human manure applied on it. So just asking the questions of, I wonder what might have happened on this land historically.
I
Because
didn't
some
even
people
know
have.
they use human manure.
Sorry?
I didn't even know they use human manure, but I suppose they can.
I can. It's legal in this country, which
Wow.
is crazy.
Oh,
Yeah.
and that's how you're seeing so much heavy metals is through that?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. 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 And pharmaceuticals, you're right. So it's passing through people and then being put on land, and that stuff can be really challenging to remediate. It's not to say that none of it that it's impossible to remediate, but there's certainly things that are going to be harder. And again, this comes to the role of our friends, the fungi, so really stimulating beneficial fungi to help remediate, and they're being used to do things like remediate radiation. So around Fukushima,
mm,
um, to pull heavy metals out of the ground, to pull a lot of ag chemicals out of the ground. That there are mushrooms that will do that. Oyster mushrooms, pretty amazing
yeah, in
fungi.
research they found as well. I mean, there's just so much talk about mycotoxins and all this stuff now, which is very valid. It's such a problem, but um, there's also research showing that different species of fungi, like Candida, for instance, when that person is extremely toxic, like with heavy metals, it will overgrow as a protective mechanism. So it's kind of like similarly what you're saying is we don't want to like
Yeah.
eradicate all of the fungi. It's doing it for a reason. You have to look back at the toxicity level of the body. And similarly with the soil, you have to look at that toxicity as well.
Yeah.
And the reason why I mentioned the soil test is because you also mentioned and I guess this is more of a question for farmers, but you know, they made some of these changes, but some of them had radical changes and some of them didn't because the
Mhm.
species of their soil, some of them already had a lot of them that were really good and some of them didn't. And so they saw this great reward by switching it. So
Mhm.
that's why I mostly ask the question of the soil test is because if someone's going to start growing something to know, like, what you're deficient in or what you're working with first, I would think would be really helpful.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, it's like doing your blood tests and your fecal tests and all these things for the human body, just to get a baseline is a good idea. Some of these things are hard to test for.
Yeah,
Some of these chemicals are really hard to test. Um, there's more biological testing coming out, but that has pros and cons as well. That's why I'm more interested in what's happening structurally because it tells you a lot, or the plant communities tell you a lot, like what plant species, if they've been allowed to grow, what are they saying about this particular piece of land?
yeah,
Yeah, and I don't think that anything's insurmountable. So,
yeah,
there
yeah,
there are soils certainly on the coast and Californian coast, they have got really low calcium. Those are hard soils to remediate because calcium's so important, just like it is in the human body for every single cell wall and pH and bones and teeth. It's the same in the soil. And we really want to see a pretty good foundation of calcium
Yeah.
for health, overall health. And so there's a few soils along the coast that I would be that's going to be expensive to
Yeah.
get back on it.
Maybe want to know that first.
Yeah. But I think rather than that would be, because you can get a soil test, but you can't necessarily interpret it, is to work with a coach or work with a mentor to kind of help some of these decisions so you don't end up having something that is going to be costly.
Yeah.
And that's part of what we do is we train coaches so that there's people that can support you on your journey.
Yes. Yes. I'm gonna have you shout that out in just a minute as we're finishing up here. But I think one of the most obvious questions for people, without using some of these agents is because, like you said, you're seeing like so much. They actually have way less problems when they tend to go to more of these regenerative practices. But I think for a lot of people, the question that they have is not using some of these things, like how do they keep pests and bugs and just really poor education about weeds, for
Mhm.
instance, which you talk about a lot, and diversity
Yeah.
and things like that. And so I know that can be a loaded question. You don't have to spend much time on it, but um, you know, if you could give just a couple key points on there to help shift some of that mindset a little bit, what would you say to people when they're, going through that in their mind?
Well, that's where I think education is so important. So being able to understand why is it that you're seeing this kind of insect, or why is it you're seeing this kind of weed plant, and doing the monitoring and testing to so you could actually see, well, this potentially could show up. We might see these fungal diseases because of the health of this particular plant.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so I mean, a lot of it is observational and just deepening. Like, one of the best things I find to shift mindset is often just digging a hole where someone's been managing land for a long time, and then digging a hole under a fence line where they haven't been managing it, and just see like, wow, this is why water's not going into the property. This is why we have such poor growth or pests and diseases, is because that whole soil structure has collapsed under their management.
Mhm.
So I'm always kind of looking for those things that I think are most impactful for people, is that realization that, oh, wow, water's not going in. No wonder we have flash floods and droughts all the time, is we literally don't have a water cycle that's working.
Yeah, and someone kind of starting out maybe on a small scale, say maybe even like their yard or a little bit of their land or something.
Mm.
What are some um keys that you would encourage them as well? Like just diversity, stop pulling all the weeds. Like what are some just small scale maybe tips that you would encourage people to incorporate?
I do like compost. I do like seed dressings. I do like addressing what are you planting into? Obviously it's going to be different if you're doing raised beds, or if you're spending the time really preparing that soil system for the plants that you're wanting to grow. But
Mhm.
I think wherever you're at and whatever scale you're at, just starting to grow food. Even if you're in an apartment, like growing sprouts, so
Yeah.
simple, so full of enzymes and all the beneficial metabolites when seeds sprout. I mean, there's a magic in sprouted seeds. But I think really learning, where does your food come from? Go and meet a farmer. Getting kind of connected back into the food system, I think, is the missing right now. And also what we're seeing is hugely exciting, is young people coming back into agriculture, and yeah, getting into this really exciting domain of food production, because there's so much to learn. And what I'm finding is people really do want to share their knowledge. So that's why I think mentors and coaches is so great, is even if you are in a home gardening situation, go and find a community gardens, go and find a community of people that actually are reconnected and aren't just sitting on their phones all the time.
Yeah. And as a segue to that, I know that you're not just sitting on your farm in Montana. You're a very busy lady. You do all these teaching and coaching as well. You actually just did a project with Dr. Zach Bush, who's been very integrative in integral, in, also uncovering some of this for health of the human body. What are some things you're
Yeah.
currently working on, or what's some of the vision that you have in the near future of what you guys are doing over there?
Oh gosh, we always have such fun projects going on, but a lot of what we're working on is training the trainers. So we're calling these people the keystone humans who are going back out into their different places around the world and really shifting what's possible for land management and food production and on any scale, really. So I'm excited about the people that we get to work with, the people that we get to train. And what we're seeing is these younger generation, but also even older generation farmers who are like, I'm ready for a switch, I'm ready for a career change. And just to see the light come back in their eyes around this whole world, it's so exciting, and empowering for farmers. I think in the past we've been kind of creating this monoculture of the mind as well as a monoculture of food production, and getting creative and excited about, what kind of food, even if that's cooking, how much diversity can you put into your meals? Where is that food coming from? I think there's a whole world out there.
Yes, yes, there is. Well, we thank you
Mhm.
so much for your time. Do you want to shout out a little bit about, your teaching and coaching programs? Where do people find you, follow you, get more information?
Yeah, please do connect. We have a bunch of online schools, but the Soil Health Foundations, I think, is a great place to start, no matter if you have a home garden or more extensive production. Um, we often are doing in-person workshops, so please do follow us on Instagram or Facebook or on our newsletter, Integrity Soils. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you again so much
Cool.
for your time. We love chatting with you. And until next time, everybody, we'll catch you on the next episode.